Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the ongoing war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the biggest foreign policy trends that have been going on in the past few weeks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
All right, so Tristen, how are things going, man?
Yeah, all's very well over here.
Well, that's good to hear. For those keeping track out there in the Little League world, the McFarland underdogs, as we are known, we kicked off the season and we are 0-1. Yes, there are ties until you get to the playoffs. So we tied our first game, but we're looking to come back with a win once we get back to it after spring break.
Fantastic. And it is spring break there.
Not at Georgetown University. That was last month, but for public schools in the area, yes. So I am coming to you from sunny Florida right now, and I will be spending the day at Disney World tomorrow. So I'm getting ready for all the magic.
Well, fantastic. And as I continue to come to you from gray, wet, rainy, damp Cambridge, I'm infinitely jealous.
Well, I can't lie. It is pretty spectacular here right now. But on a more depressing note, for many of us, as my neighbor mentioned last week, I don't want to go look at my what is now known as a 301k to see where my retirement earnings are at. So, Tristen, last week was crazy. Ups and downs, stock market, because of the Trump administration's announcement on tariffs and everything. So that's one of the things we want to look at today. We're also going to look at Iran talks. The U.S. and Iran held direct talks over the weekend. And we're also going to give folks a little bit of an update on Ecuadorian politics. But let's start off with the tariffs. Where do we even begin? Tristen, I'll let you.
Where do we begin? I mean, to describe these past couple of weeks as a roller coaster seems like an understatement. As I think we all know by now, President Trump imposed sweeping tariffs earlier this month, targeting goods from 60 countries and territories, which marks a significant shift in U.S. trade policy. And that too cannot, or certainly I cannot, emphasize enough just how monumental a change this has been. And the White House has since announced that the administration would ease tariffs to a universal 10% level for most countries and implement a 90-day pause on new tariffs for all trading partners except for China, just to add to the further confusion and tumult. Now, on China specifically, the American president has sharply, if not dramatically, increased tariffs to 145%. This is a radical escalation that follows Beijing's own retaliatory measures, which saw a rise in Chinese tariffs on U.S. goods going from 84% to 125%. So basically, the trade war, certainly between the United States and China, has heated up to an absolute zenith. We've had a roller coaster time looking at international trade between the United States and the rest of the world. And look, all of this turbulence, I think we're only at the beginning of it. How does it feel? How does it look from your side of the Atlantic?
Well, I think it's the same. You look at the stock market over the last 2 weeks and the bond market, which many people were saying was what really spooked President Trump to walk back some of these, give these 90-day exemptions. But then at the same time, there's all this talk over, are there going to be certain exemptions for like iPhones or certain things coming out of China? So I was reading this morning that President Trump doesn't like the terms exemptions or exceptions because it looks like he's caving in or maybe giving in to somebody like Tim Cook at Apple so that they don't have these tariffs on their products coming out of China, things like that. But all that is doing is creating this tumultuous market where investors don't know what's going to be happening next week or next month, let alone tomorrow on things. So it's creating a very difficult situation in investment and things like this. And companies and investors don't like this, right? They want to be able to think, okay, if I'm going to invest hundreds of millions or billions of dollars into something, that the situation is going to be fairly similar to what it is now in a year or 6 months or something like that. And that's obviously not what we have right now, because stuff is just all over the place. And we're still waiting to hear what's going to happen with some of these semiconductors and things like that, and exemptions or exceptions for certain things with that. We've already seen the Chinese hit back where it's going to hurt us on critical minerals and magnets and things like that that they produce and we don't, for some very important things in the green energy economy and in the defense industry and things like that. So this is far from over at this point, because this is one of Trump's big things, right? That he's talked about for years, is this tariff issue. And what I don't understand, then maybe you can talk about this too, from seeing it from your vantage point in the UK, but also as a Canadian, and what the Europeans are thinking from being overseas. On the one hand, you have the administration saying and firmly believing that they need to implement these tariffs for the long haul so that it drives the growth and creation of these industries in the United States, and that the US starts making things again. And we have these middle class jobs that have disappeared since the 1970s in the United States, which you can argue back and forth on whether or not that would actually happen, and if those kinds of jobs are even out there anymore for Americans. But then on the other side, you have those in the administration saying it's all a negotiation tactic. Like, he's going to create these huge tariffs to force these other countries to come to the table and then negotiate better, more fair trade practices and trade deals with the United States. But those both can't be true, right? If you're really trying to grow the industry, then this is a long haul. The tariffs have to stay on so that companies do spend the time and money to invest in America. But if you're going to let them go and then just create better trade deals, they're not going to do that. So it's confusing.
Yeah, it is confusing. And the messaging is not just confused, but these two lines being at odds with one another creates massive disincentives for investment, both for individual investors and indeed large corporations and manufacturers who might be incentivized to set up a new factory. Simply put, why would you invest millions in a new factory in the United States if in a couple of years, a couple of months, who knows, maybe by the time we're done recording this podcast, suddenly the incentive structure has not just changed a little bit, but dramatically changed. And this is why we see the bond market going in some very concerning directions. This is why we see the stock market having the seesaw effect that it did, and now very much trading sideways. And look at the flight to precious metals, namely to gold. Gold has reached an all-time high, and it's no surprise why in this moment, and I fear an extended moment of absolute uncertainty and just, look, not just policy madness, but for somebody who brands themselves as the great negotiator, this is just an astoundingly, what's the polite way to put it, bizarre, if not counterproductive way to go about achieving your own end.
Yeah. And something that obviously doesn't look to end anytime soon. So we'll be keeping an eye on this as new developments arise moving forward.
Absolutely. Well, switching gears, let's talk about the U.S. Iran nuclear talks. The Americans and Iranian officials held their first round of nuclear talks in Oman this past Saturday. And both sides described the meeting as positive and constructive. And the two countries are now preparing for a second round of negotiations scheduled for this coming Saturday in Rome. And these talks, it seems to me, represent a dramatic reversal of what had been the American president's position during certainly the entirety of his first term, where he went to the length of unilaterally withdrawing the United States from the 2015 Iran deal. What is going on here? Why this sudden, again, another sudden reversal in a major policy?
Yeah. So I think, to your point, this is a huge reversal of one of Trump's key and core policies from the first administration. I mean, obviously, the hardline stance towards Iran was a key component of his first administration. And I think, just to step back a little bit to provide some background, one of the key issues and reasons that he was so adamantly against it, I think, were twofold. One, that was just Republican policy in the mid 2010s, right? The Republicans came out adamantly opposed to the 2015 JCPOA agreement between Iran and the P5+1. And that said that it was a bad deal. It didn't touch on anything other than the nuclear component of the broader Iran regional relationship because we didn't talk about Hezbollah or Hamas or the Houthis and what they were doing in the area and things like that. Well, that was because the Obama administration specifically separated those things out, right? Understanding that we probably aren't going to be able to get a nuclear deal if we are talking about all this other stuff as well. So let's focus on the nuclear side of this with the hope, probably ill-founded to some extent, but we'll never actually know at this point, that freeing up this money and creating a situation where Iran was interacting with the West again more would show people the path that they could be going down as far as like openness to the West and things like that, in the hopes that that would be a way to loosen up the hardliners in Iran and everything. So first of all, it was a Republican talking point that it was a bad deal and it had to go. And then Trump also jumped on that. And then also it was a deal that he didn't negotiate. So he didn't like it. So he did unilaterally remove the US from that deal. So what's going on now, though, and what's different is the Middle East is a vastly different place in 2025 to what it was in 2018 when he left the agreement. And the big issue is Iran is on its back foot, but you also have a more ascendant Israel. And there's two key things that Trump doesn't want to have happen in the Middle East. One is Iran getting a nuclear weapon and going full nuclear. And the second one is a broader Middle East war breaking out that he has to step into. So what that means is he knows that the Israelis are willing now, especially after what's taken place in the past 18 months or so, are willing to bomb Iranian nuclear sites and try to stop the nuclear program militarily. So he doesn't want that to happen because he doesn't want to potentially get sucked into a larger war. And he wants to negotiate so that they don't go down the nuclear path and he can fix this with an agreement instead of military action. The problem is it's highly unlikely that he's going to be able to get a deal that's actually better than the one that we had in 2015. And also, it's important to remember, I was working as a presidential daily briefing book briefer to Secretary of State John Kerry during the first Iran nuclear talks. And having Steve Witkoff run off to Oman or Rome once a week while trying to negotiate Ukraine and Hamas, Israel, and all these other deals just isn't going to be feasible. So John Kerry spent the last 3 weeks before the 2015 Iran nuclear deal was signed in Europe, negotiating directly with the P5+1 and the Iranians, and talking about this in terms of, oh, we're going to meet again in Rome next week, and we're going to come up with a deal. Like this, again, this is going to take time because it's what are the parameters on this? The fact that they did have direct talks is really, really good, but there's a lot of different things to take into account here. The Iranian foreign minister is going to meet with the Russian foreign minister this week. So what role does Russia play in this? What role does the U.S. ongoing talks with Russia over Ukraine play into this? And I don't know, where do the Europeans fall into this, right? I mean, they spent a huge amount of time dealing with this in the Obama administration and were key partners to get the deal to happen. So that's going to play a big role too. What are folks in your side of the woods saying on this?
Well, certainly it's the absence of European voices on this that is in many ways deafening and really causes myself and those that I'm talking to over here to wonder really what's going on and is this achievable in any sort of way without the buy-in, particularly of the European partners who were there, who were not just there, central in the negotiations that culminated in 2015. Something about this, it just strikes me the way in which these negotiations are being held. It once again just seems like another example of performance,
Right.
of negotiation for the papers, for the cameras, this back and forth to Europe every week. Sometimes that performative dimension is necessary and a really good card to play in a negotiation. But it strikes me as this is not the time for it. That is not going to get the parties, the critical parties, to where they need to be at the table and on the issues. And so I would be astounded if this went in a positive direction at all, but certainly anytime soon.
Yeah, and don't get us wrong. I don't mean to speak for you, but I'm pretty sure that you feel the same way as I do. We are highly skeptical because of all the reasons we both just noted. But if they get a deal that stops Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon and stops Israel and potentially the U.S. along with it from bombing Iran and potentially starting a broader regional war, we are all for that.
Oh, absolutely.
We're just saying,
Yes,
we're just saying
absolutely.
that there's a lot that needs to happen for a deal to actually get put on the table that both sides would be okay with because of all the things we've talked about with like, where are the Europeans? Where are the Russians? Are this? Where are the Chinese on
Indeed.
this? The Iran, China, Russia relationship is vastly different today than it was in 2014, 2015, when they originally started negotiating that deal. So this is, again, something that's going to take time and a lot of sustained effort that I don't know if this administration, given the fact that they're using Witkoff for everything, is going to be able to do, because I do distinctly remember back in 2015 that there were huge chunks of time that the Secretary of State was devoting, not 100% to this, but would be on the ground somewhere
Yeah.
negotiating this for days, weeks at a time. And when you're trying to do that, plus Russia, Ukraine, plus Hamas, Israel, I worry that you're going to end up fumbling all of them instead of getting any of them right.
We only have so much bandwidth to deal with things, right? That's out a day-to-day routine flying around the world. If only the United States had a Secretary of State who might be able to pick up the ball on one of these issues.
Right. The chief diplomat seems to be sidelined on a lot of this stuff.
Well, maybe he's the one talking to the Europeans.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Anyways, we'll keep an eye on this. They're slated to talk again, this time in moving things to Rome. We'll see where this goes. It's good that they're talking, and hopefully something can come of this, but time will tell.
Absolutely.
And one thing, just to get us out of here on, I know that those of you who listen regularly remember us talking about the upcoming elections in Ecuador. So those happened over the past week, and the incumbent president, who we talked about before, Daniel Noboa, he's the 37-year-old heir to a banana empire. He won the presidential election with 56% of the vote, compared to 44% of the vote for his leftist challenger, Luisa Gonzalez. So this ended up not being as close of a race as we had thought it was going to be when we talked about this a little while ago. In the previous runoff in 2023, Noboa defeated Gonzalez by just 52% to 48%. So this time he won with a bigger percentage of the vote. And as we noted in the podcast episode, this stems largely from ongoing violence in Ecuador. And Noboa has been tough on crime, much like many of his Latin American colleagues, one of whom was in the United States recently. And he's been more apt to crack down on violence and things of that nature. And he seems to have been rewarded for that at the polls. So we'll have to see where this goes and see if this tougher stance, he's going to have a full 4-year term now to implement this, and we'll see what happens. So that ends our news roundup. Now we move on to our conversation on the Democratic Republic of the Congo with Mélanie Gouby. Mélanie is an investigative journalist, writer, and documentary filmmaker based in London. Her work focuses on the systemic root causes underpinning violence and conflict and their impact on human rights, development, and the environment. She was the East Africa correspondent to the French newspaper Le Figaro from 2014 to 2016 and has contributed to outlets including The Guardian, The New York Times, Foreign Policy, and many others. In May 2012, Mélanie covered the early days of the M23 rebellion for the Associated Press. She was previously the bureau chief for the Institute for War and Peace Reporting in the Eastern DRC. Let's listen into the conversation. All right, folks, welcome back to this episode of History and Headlines. Like I said, we're going to get into a mini deep dive on the Democratic Republic of Congo. And joining us today to talk about that is Mélanie Gouby. And Mélanie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This is a pretty complex issue, and we want to get our listeners up to date on where we are and what's been going on. So, can you give us a little bit of a background explainer on the DRC and what the current situation is? Some of our folks may have heard about like the M23 rebels and mineral resources in part of the country, but can you just walk us through the main causes of the conflict and why we may be moving towards peace talks?
Yeah, sure. As you said, it's extremely complex. This conflict really has roots that date back to colonization and the displacements of population that the Belgian colonizers did in the area, moving Tutsi and Hutu from Rwanda into DRC to work in their plantations and creating hierarchies between so-called ethnic group that they essentially created because what we see as solid and almost genetic groups were very fluid and more based on social interactions and status and various other factors. So they've created this very deep separation between people that have translated into independence in modern times and created this tension over land and who belongs in certain places and power, of course, between all these people. And that peaked with the Rwandan genocide in 1994, during which 800,000 people were killed, mostly Tutsi, and created the scene for the coming to power of Paul Kagame, who was the leader of a Tutsi rebellion that put an end to the Rwandan genocide and so took power in Rwanda and chased the Hutu militias responsible for the Rwandan genocide into DRC, where they were able to regroup. And so the first Congo war was started by essentially Paul Kagame and his Tutsi rebellion now in power in Rwanda, chasing these Hutu militias in Congo and through Congo, and ending in the capital Kinshasa, housing Mobutu Sese Seko, the Congolese dictator who was ruling Congo at the time, and putting in place a Congolese rebel, Laurent Désiré Kabila, instead of Mobutu in power in Congo. And what we've seen for the past 30 years essentially is Rwanda trying to retain control over the east of the DRC through a similar Congolese rebellion that they have backed to help them with essentially two main things. The first one is that these Hutu militias that fled into Congo and regrouped, it still exists. It's called the FDLR, and they still have an anti-Tutsi or a genocidal ideology. And so that poses a threat, or the Rwandan government says it poses a threat to Rwandan security. The FDLR now is a very small group, so whether that really is a threat for the Rwandan security and national security is very much up to debate, but that is still very much part of their logic or their stated logic for backing Congolese rebellion, the M23. And the other obvious part of the reason why this is still going on is that Rwanda is a very small country with very little resources. And DRC is obviously huge and has, therefore, a lot of land and a lot of resources that are very important to Rwandan economic survival. So people talk a lot about minerals, and that's obviously a very important part of it. It's the number one export for Rwanda, and we know that most minerals that Rwanda export do come from DRC. But it's much more than that. It's access to land, access to the wool of the Congolese economy. You know, every day, if you stand at the border between Rwanda and Congo, you will see tens of thousands of Rwandan who go into DRC to work for the day. So it's extremely important. And what a lot of people see as a trigger for this particular iteration of the conflict this time is Congo joining the East African Community, which is a free trade community that includes Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, and other countries. And so Congo joining this community opened it up to investment from the rest of the region and created a real threat for Rwanda's interest in DRC.
Yeah, and you mentioned Rwanda a lot. Obviously, Rwanda plays a key role in all of this and the ethnic tensions that have been there for a long time, over a century, as you mentioned, with dating back to colonialism. One reason we wanted to talk about the DRC and what was going on is because there was supposed to be peace talks earlier this month in early April, and those didn't happen. So, why did the peace talks not move forward? And is there a way even for some sort of sustained peace to happen without Rwanda involved in the peace talks?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I guess I should say that there is really like three players in this conflict, right? There's the Congolese government, there is Rwanda, and then there is the M23. And the M23, they're largely puppets at this point in this conflict, and we can talk about why. But they are the interlocutor for the Congolese government in the negotiation today. The Congolese government is not negotiating with Rwanda, largely because Rwanda is denying any, or
Right.
maybe at this stage is not really denying any involvement, but is refusing to acknowledge the full extent of its involvement in the conflict. And it's never been more involved in this conflict than today, frankly. Most of the troops on the ground in DRC are Rwandan troops. The M23, while in the past was a more substantial force and really with its own agenda, today it's a much smaller force than the Rwandan troops. And so the problem with these negotiations is that the Congolese government is obviously very aware of that. And so who they really want to be negotiating with is Rwanda, not the M23. And that has led them to send people who don't necessarily have the power to negotiate a real peace deal and sending signal that they're not taking this negotiation very seriously. And so, of course, for the M23, that's not acceptable. And that's not the basis for serious negotiation either. Of course, the M23 would like to be taken seriously. And so the basis for honest and real negotiation is not there, unfortunately.
So, yeah, the situation is not yet ripe for negotiations, and that's why we are seeing what we're seeing right now on the ground. Are you optimistic? You've talked about a lot of the baggage that comes with this conflict over decades and even a century going back to colonialism. Rwanda's not getting any bigger. They're not like finding mineral resources within their own country. So their desire for continued access to these mineral resources isn't going anywhere. And the M23 rebels are going to continue to need Rwandan backing. So I've just listed a few things that will make you think that this is going to continue, but are there optimistic things out there that you see that could take place, could happen, that would change the calculus of the players on whether or not it's time for negotiations? And is there some sort of basis that they could agree on that would create the situation that would end this fighting?
Yeah, so I think actually recent history has shown us that this is not such a difficult conflict to resolve. At least the direct involvement in Rwanda militarily in Congo is not so difficult to put an end to. That's what happened already 10 years ago. So when I was living in Goma, there was a conflict, the same conflict happened with the M23. So 2012 to 2013. It ended quite quickly because the international community's response was really strong after the M23 took Goma in November 2012. The international community cut aid to Rwanda and put enormous pressure on Kigali. Barack Obama called Paul Kagame directly. The pressure was absolutely enormous, and then the UN was properly mobilized. There was an intervention brigade that was created. Kinshasa put in good troops that had just been trained on the front line. And so within a few months, the M23 collapsed and they fled into Uganda and Rwanda. And so the rebellion was ended. What went wrong after that is where things get a little bit more complex. But in terms of putting an end to the operation, to the rebellion on the ground and their control of the area, we know what to do. It's happened in the past. Rwanda is extremely dependent on foreign aid. They cannot survive for very long with that and without various other support from the international community. So the leverage on them is very important.
So on the flip side, there's recent chatter in the U.S. and in the press about some sort of U.S. DRC deal that would allow the United States to go in and gain some of that mineral access or gain access to some of those minerals that we've been discussing. So you were talking about pressure on Rwanda from the international community. We'll see how effective that may be given the state of the world today versus 2012. It may be hard to get that international backing that we were able to do back then because just the world is a different place. In the US, I don't necessarily see President Trump working with the UN and the international community to put pressure on Kagame, let alone pick up the phone and call him. But there could be something on the other side. If the US signs some sort of deal with the DRC, there could be pressure coming from that way. What is out there in the ether of talks about this with the US signing some sort of deal with the DRC?
No one really knows what's in this deal at the moment, and it's all in the details, of course. On the surface, you could think whatever you want of this, right? Like, at the end of the day, mining operations in DRC are not industrial mining in any way, by and large, not done by Congolese companies. So this idea of selling permits to foreign companies is what's already happening in DRC. And what the government gets in return is money, right? Waging a war is extremely expensive. The DRC defense budget in 2023 was one of the two fastest growing defense budgets in the world with Sudan. And so you can imagine the sort of financial pressure that puts on a country like DRC with such a small national budget. So, you know, all of this is about money, and what the DRC is going to get in the end, again, it really depends on their capacity to negotiate well and what's in the details. If that comes also with the American government committing to putting pressure diplomatically and otherwise on Rwanda, then that could be really beneficial too, right? If the idea is like in Ukraine, that with US economic interest in the DRC, then comes an interest in protecting the DRC's sovereignty from the invader. It really can go any kind of way because, of course, they could also get really bad terms and get very little for it and maybe regain sovereignty, but then lose enormously in terms of their economic potential. So it's really hard to tell at this point. And I think personally, I'm not against it. Not that anyone cares, but I'm not against it from the get-go because I think in many ways what DRC needs is more involvement, more investment, and better investment that it's been getting from, for example, the Chinese. And maybe American companies are that. Who knows with the direction that things are taking in the US, but let's see.
Yeah, if nothing else, the U.S. track record is better on knowledge transfer, technology transfer, working with workers on the ground instead of shipping in workers and things like that. We will see. Melanie, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kelly. Really appreciate you.
Thanks again to Melanie for her time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.